So, hi, Stewart. Thanks for granting us this interview. I'm very happy to have you here. So, you're a freelance book designer, and so can you give me a bit of background on how you became a freelance book designer?
Sure, and it's good to meet you too, and it's good to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. Um, I started out in the publishing world working in magazines and newspapers, and primarily I was art directing in Seattle for quite a long time for various publications in that area. So in the United States, there used to be more of a presence with free newspapers that were used to give weekly information in the cities, and so I worked for a number of those at one time. But I wanted to work with books because I've always loved reading and I love books since I was a little kid. And I always thought that the publishing industry was fascinating to me, and what cover designers did was the kind of thing I really wanted to do as a graphic designer, even in college, I think, or posters, things like that. Because I always kind of looked at books as being smaller versions of posters, in that kind of regard. So what I did when I was working in publishing is I started to write people. I mean, when I worked for periodicals, I would write people at different publishers around the United States and just basically ask them if they needed any cover design. And I used my newspaper cover designs as a way to kind of prove to them that I could actually do what I was asking for, rather than just coming out of school and without any experience in asking somebody. I knew that I had to kind of prove myself first before anybody would hire me. And this was in the early 90s, so luckily a lot of people were more available. There were a lot more smaller publishers in the United States that you could contact, and a lot of these people needed the help that I was asking to provide. And I started to get jobs here and there, and I didn't turn down anything. I knew that every job that I could do was something I could put in my portfolio and add on to that, and then I could get bigger and bigger clients as I moved along. At the same time, though, I stayed in publishing for the entire duration of that time, and I kept getting jobs as art director for different magazines at this point. And so it was really hard for me to move to a publishing house or a publishing firm, particularly in Seattle, because there wasn't really that many. There were only a couple, and they weren't hiring anybody at the time. So what happened is at one point I left the country and I traveled for a while, and I came back to the United States, and then luckily for me an opportunity opened up in a publisher in a larger publishing organization, which was called Sasquatch Books, and they hired me as a senior designer, and I stayed there for a few years. And then I worked for another magazine after that, and I ended up in New York City. So this is kind of a long story. So in New York City, I couldn't find any work at all. So I was having a hard time getting permanent work, at an office. And I just decided to go to business for myself. And this was about 7 years ago. So I took all the contacts that I had acquired over the last decade, and I just used them. And I started, cold calling people and getting my foot in the door and talking to other people. And I started to build a presence. And I knew at this time too it was really important to work on my online presence. So I was always doing online portfolios. And I had I can't even remember the last time I showed anybody a physical portfolio where I took a book out and I showed it to them. Nobody really uses it anymore. And so I was making websites back in the early 90s, and those have really helped because I really don't know where people find my work, but it's everywhere. Everywhere I can put my work out there, I do, and there's Coreflot or Behance or Mediafire and you guys, and I'm always trying to promote my name through the internet. And people, I think, don't have a lot of time to look for things, so they find a website and they scroll through it, and if they like it, they'll contact you. That's it, and basically how I got to where I am now. And a lot of hard work and a lot of persistence, I think, too.
Yeah, these are definitely the ingredients for success, I think. No, I really like the fact that, as you say, you put all your work out there and on different platforms. And I checked your blog, and you're one of the few designers I've seen on Reelsy who comments on every project he's doing and posts the covers or different alternatives he came up with during the process and how the process was. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time going through different projects, and I see too few designers doing that.
I don't know why that is. I've noticed that as well, and I think sometimes it has to do with this idea that when people sign up for a portfolio, it's asking for a description, and if you have 25 covers, it seems a little daunting to write 25 descriptions at once. For me, it was always important to do it as I went along, and that way I wasn't trying to do it all at once. And I think people run out of things to say, or they're trying maybe not to they let the work speak for themselves. But for my clients, people are asking me specific questions like, do you do young adult work? Do you do mysteries? Do you or what's your process, or how many covers do you do? And I think the explanations that I give kind of demystify what goes on my end, so that people get a better idea how the process works. Because a lot of times when people hand over a check for a certain amount of money, they want to know what they're getting for it. And the blog really helps me to illustrate that for them, rather than just doing some magic trick and here's your cover. They get to actually see how it goes along. And in particular, for also people to know like how many different cover designs sometimes go into a cover for somebody like Amazon. I'll do anywhere, sometimes 13 different covers before they decide on one that they like. So it's there's quite a bit of work involved in that, and I know that that's not unusual. People like Knopf from the bigger publishers also work that way as well. So I enjoy doing it. I like the blog. It's fun. The blog has become kind of my portfolio in a way, because people don't seem to go to the regular website. They go to the blog.
Yeah,
the blog has way more stuff on it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I went directly to the blog, I think, and no, I really like the idea because I think I like to believe there's a story behind each cover, and it's nice to see some of these stories told, basically. So you mentioned you've worked for a lot of publishers, small publishers, bigger publishers. Now it seems you're shifting more towards independent publishers. Is that independent authors? Is that true?
Yeah, it is. It has become something that I saw more and more over maybe the last 3 or 4 years, where once the Kindle came out, and authors were looking for a way to publish their work, because I think, I don't know what the percentages of people who mail their manuscripts to bigger publishing houses get read. Like, most people don't get read. It's such a rare occurrence, and I think people had something to say, and they wanted to do it. And Kindle and the electronic publishing industry was able to give people a voice and a way to do that. And and create space in those kinds of companies or businesses, which is part of Amazon, for a small fee, you could do that. So what happens when people were starting to write me independently, and it was very different for me because I usually never deal with authors.
Yeah.
And I realized I enjoyed it quite a bit, because sometimes they have really good ideas, and or they just want you to do it whatever you feel like, but it's always different. And I like that direct line of communication with people. In a business world, usually I'm talking to a marketing person and an editor, who then deals with the author and the publisher, and it's just, I never know what's going on half the time. But I'd say maybe half my work comes from that now, half or more than that.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting, and I think maybe you have more creative freedom if you work directly with the author. Is that the case, or?
I've often found over the years that the less I get paid, the more creative freedom I have. It's an interesting thing to say, because when people have larger budgets, they tend to have know an idea of exactly what they want to do. When smaller people, if you explain to them, the more ideas, the more complicated an idea is, the more they'll have to spend. They're more inclined to relinquish control of things and let you kind of do what you want if the budget is kept down. But I never use that as a way to just kind of do whatever I feel like, because I think it's really important for me to hear what the author is telling me and what they want, and I want to make sure that whatever I do is something that they're happy with and is selling their book. And sometimes it takes a little convincing. Sometimes people will will hear my quote and then they'll leave. But recently, I had a guy who wrote me last year. He was an author, and he wanted to work with me, and then I quoted him a price, and then he said he was going to go with somebody else. About 3 weeks later, he came back and said it didn't work out. So I ended up doing a cover based on what I wanted to do, and it ended up on National Public Radio's list of top books from 2014, which is on my blog right now. So that was one of those cases where somebody kind of let me do what I thought was the right thing to do, and it ended up paying off pretty well.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I can see that. And you also mentioned on your blog on one of the projects that you started experimenting with illustration, just to to mix things up a bit. I imagine. Do you prefer working with stock imagery or working with illustration now, or mix both?
Well, that's another thing that has to do with I think with budgets in a way, because I think there is a lot of inexpensive stock photography out there right now, and it's hard to convince somebody to spend more money on an illustration than say $10 or $25 on a photo if they don't have the money. And this is another thing that's similar to my experience becoming a book designer, is I'm not an illustrator. I haven't done it for a living. I like to illustrate, but it's one of those things where I kind of have to prove myself to people in order to get them to hire me. So I'm doing more smaller jobs that don't pay as much just to get the experience and to kind of have the work to show for it. And those people are more inclined to let me do it. But I also, it's one of those things. If they didn't like it, I would do it over in a way that they preferred. But I do like illustrating, and I do think as a designer, you kind of have to either you follow trends or you do something to keep yourself entertained. Because I wouldn't be happy if I was doing the same kind of thing all the time, like an auteur that only works with words or something, because you won't get the jobs if you just say, well, this is the only thing I'm doing. I have to be more flexible than that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I feel like with the surge of independent publishing and the number of books that indie authors are putting out there every year, I think that having an illustration, something that's really 100% unique, that cannot be purchased off the internet, I think that adds really value, and more authors are starting to understand that. So it's definitely good to have both skills in there.
I would agree. I think one thing that's happened over the years is the stock photography is not keeping up with the demand, I think. So you tend to start seeing the same photographs
totally
repeated on people's books, and that would be, that's embarrassing, I think, for the author. I mean, for a company like Amazon, who require me to either they're going to buy an image that's rights managed, which is very expensive to own an image, or I'm going to make a composite of different images that's unique looking. So there might be elements of an image that's already out there, which you probably won't be able to tell because I've got it made into something else. And I think that people are starting to see that now. Like you can't just spend a couple of bucks and get an image and put your picture on it because somebody else is doing the very same thing somewhere else, and you can get confused.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you mentioned working with the Amazon imprint, Amazon Publishing, and with big publishers. Are both very similar, or has Amazon something special, different from your perspective?
Amazon's interesting in that they contract through other publishers, so they use a middleman as opposed to just dealing directly. At least in my case, I don't deal directly with them. So I work through another company who's dealing with Amazon as their client, and then I'm the contractor.
That's really
so it's not the same. Like when I work for other publishers, I'm dealing directly with that publisher. So Amazon has a kind of a buffer between them, and I'm not sure why that is, but they have several different imprints. So everything from crime to thrillers to romance, and I work particularly in the thriller genre for some reason. I got kind of pegged as a guy who does thrillers, but it is a little different. I mean, like I said, there's a period of time when I'm working on a project, I'll hand over some designs and I won't hear back for weeks. So and I have to wait for my contact because they're doing something internally and they're talking, and then when they make a decision, they'll get back to me. So it has changed. I think the bigger the company, the more projects tend to take, the more time they take.
Yeah, no, of course, I can imagine that. I can imagine that. How do you see the publishing landscape moving in the US? It's interesting to have like a freelance designer perspective on that because we hear publishers talk about it, we hear authors talk about it, but we don't hear anything from the professionals who work for publishers and for authors.
Well, I think what's happening is more people are paying, like publishers are paying attention to what independent people are doing. I mean, you'll see electronic books becoming print books, or even like people who write blogs are starting to publish books. So I think people who know how to make money are watching what's becoming popular, and they're not so dismissive anymore of what independent people are doing in the publishing realm. I think what's always important is if the book is good. I don't think, no matter how much a designer works on a cover or a typesetter can do on an interior, is going to change something that people don't want to read and isn't popular. So when I do books, later on I'll go back and look and see how they're doing.
Yeah.
And most of the time nobody's right, like, what a great cover that is. It's, whether or not they like the plot. And so I think people are starting to become better writers. Or there are people out there who are good writers and have good ideas, and those are the things that are getting them noticed and also getting me work. And those are the jobs that that anybody would want to be associated with, because the more popular a book is, the more people are going to see my work, and then I'll get more work off of that. But if nobody hears about you, then it doesn't happen. And I think a bigger firm would have a PR part of their office that would push that book, make sure it got into advertising, or the advertising it needed, and the author would get out and do readings and things like that. And it's interesting, you don't really see that much anymore because, for one thing, we don't really have that many small bookstores anymore in the United States. Well, authors will come and do readings. If they do readings in Pittsburgh, where I'm at, a lot of times it's a big author like Neil Gaiman, and he'll speak for $25 tickets, and so it's not the same kind of promotion anymore because Neil Gaiman doesn't really need the promotion. He's doing it because he likes to, and like for the money as well. So I think it's up to the author to make it as good as they want it to be. So there's a lot of work on their end. I just hand off the cover, and they're the ones that do everything else. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes, I think, but if you use like Facebook and Twitter and other forms of online media to get your word out there, people will pay attention eventually.
Yeah, I think so too. And you mentioned that you worked a lot on thrillers for Amazon, and I think you work across all genres, right? Is there any genre in particular that you prefer, or any special project you've worked on lately that you really liked working on in terms of the book?
I like things that are a little more visceral and work that lends itself to a more graphic edge. I think crime is like that. Crime and horror can be that way, but there's a lot of I try not to emulate what people see out there as far as what is a typical kind of horror book cover. But I do enjoy working on of all things, I do like nonfiction, and I don't tend to get to do a lot of it. I have a few publishers that publish more historical work, and you mentioned something about the Civil War in one of the emails, and I do a few of those kinds of books. Those tend to be Civil War books, and books about the Tea Party and thing tend to follow whatever's contemporary in the United States politics. So sometimes I'll get work based around those kinds of things. I do like working with archival images and in historical images, but I really love working on poetry books. There tends to be a sort of nonlinear way to think about the covers that happen with those sorts of books, and they're not conceptual in the same way a fiction book might be. A lot of times, things that are too literal to me are a little I wouldn't say boring, but they're it's more interesting to work with an abstract idea, and it's more challenging, I think, for me. I would say, like, if you're building a cover and there has to be a certain amount of elements on it, it becomes a more of a production aspect than a design aspect. So my method of working is a little weirder than that. I'm not that straightforward, actually. So
No, that's good to hear, because often what you hear from many independent authors is that if you write in a certain genre, your cover has to respect certain things and guidelines that are part of this genre. If you're writing a thriller, you have to have like pine trees in the mist on a dark background, and I always feel like if as an author you come out with a different cover, maybe you stand a better chance, even if it doesn't perfectly respect the genre. What's your opinion on it?
I would agree. I mean, if you're writing a book about something that happens in the mountains, it's a thriller, and other people who write about things in those genres have similar looking covers.
Yeah.
If I'm going to look for a book on online, and when I do those keywords, these are the covers I get. The one that I don't think looks like the rest is probably the one that I'm going to look at first. And I think you may notice, like, even with more popular authors over the years, like Stephen King, his books are always getting repackaged.
Yeah.
So they look different every few years. And I think they're trying to follow like more contemporary ideas. And so I think it's hard to convince people to do something different. I mean, even publishers will say to me, well, this book has sold quite a bit and it looks like this. Can you do something that looks like this? So that kind of aping goes on a lot in lots of industries, not just design. You see that in music all the time, like, let's make a song that sounds like this song. And I think it's not any different. But the problem is that the public's smarter than that, and after a while they get bored. And you can't. There's only such a small window of time that I think you can, like, kind of emulate an idea and still be successful. And then you got to try something different. And that's always hard to get people to be convinced to do that, because it's a risk. People have to take a risk for that, and they don't want to be the first one. And that's usually the hardest part for it.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it's always a struggle. I think you have to find the right balance between, like, staying in the genre so that people don't get scared when they see the cover, and still having this something that makes it different. I think that's the whole role of the cover designer, and to persuade the author that it's the right cover.
Yeah.
I have a very, very nice and easy question to finish. What's the art piece that's on the background?
Oh, it's one of my illustrations. It was done with different pieces of paper that I created, a giant kind of accusatory finger that's always pointing at me every single day when I come to work. It just comes out of the wall, and it's huge. It's about 6 feet long, and it's always behind me. So I don't know. It's symbolic, I guess. I look at it first thing in the morning when I come in, and it's pointing right at my seat. So yeah, it's just one of my things I got up on the wall. Inspiration, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good way to start the day. Definitely. Well, thank you so much for this interview. It's been great having you, and I look forward to keeping in touch on Ritzy.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.